I was in Maricopa County, which at the time then and now is the largest jurisdiction in Arizona. And it seems like every state has a jurisdiction that they refer to as the great state of, and then you fill it in our state, it was Maricopa. And I would talk to others in smaller jurisdictions, and they'd be like, oh my gosh, 2 million voters? How do you serve 2 million voters? And I would say, how do you do every job? There's 1 or 2 of you in the office. How do you know all the things? Because we were lucky enough to just kind of be able to silo what we needed to be an expert in, because you are expected to be an expert in all of it. And that can be incredibly challenging. So the topic, of course, that we're addressing today is funding. So you also need to be a budgeting expert, a financial expert, and a compliance expert to be able to navigate all of the waters of all of the things. So with that all said, I really wanted to kind of have this be the capstone of the day to think about. I know you've got your task force of election officials that have been meeting, and just hear from you. Does what you've heard today about the Kansas experience resonate with what you've heard with the task force, and where do you see we go from here is kind of the framing of this final piece. So in the same way that I asked Brian, what's the answer, and let's just go do that.
Great. Simple. All right, so thank you, Tammy. My name is Matt Weil, and I am the Executive Director of the Democracy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I've been in and around elections since about 2004, all that time in DC. I think I may hold the record as one of the first policy people in DC. It was right after HAVA was passed, and AEI and Brookings created the first kind of a DC-based policy project on elections. No one had any knowledge about that really in DC, and I got the bug early. One of the first people I worked with was Connie Schmidt, and so I've learned a lot about elections from Connie. Then I went over to the AAC and got to work with her directly because I was also on the team that was working on those election management guidelines and quick start guides. So I've had a lot of I've learned experience from people in the field who are, legends, honestly. But I've been with BPC now for about 11 years, and I lead our elections work, and I come to this from a policy perspective. We've heard a lot of defining the problem today, and we've heard a lot of here's what we do, and here's why it's a problem, and I don't think election policy is much different from any other policy. There are policy solutions. We have to figure out what they are and have the right conversation to fix them. So what is Bipartisan Policy Center? I usually have to start with that when I'm not in DC, and sometimes when I am in DC, because this is an organization that has bipartisan in its first name. And we do share a lot with Dole, because Dole is one of our founders as well. We were founded by 4 Senate Majority Leaders, Bob Dole, Howard Baker, George Mitchell, and Tom Daschle, back in 2007. And the idea here is, for the biggest questions that, the federal government, but, government at every level has to solve, if you want durable, long-lasting solutions, there's going to have to be bipartisan input. Otherwise, you're just not going to get the solutions that are going to last. They may switch back when the next party takes control. So we work across many areas. The best one that we work on, of course, is democracy. And I'm happy to talk about democracy, well, we have until 4 o'clock, but I'll talk to you about that at dinner as well. So thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Audrey. And thank you, Adam, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Tammy, especially for putting me last, because that meant that I have to follow everybody else who is really an expert in everything they talked about and defining the problem, and I have to find the solution. So let's talk about what is the right conversation to be having. I think that's the most important thing. Oh, I left out one thing, because I do know my team is watching, or at least they were supposed to be watching. It is a little late in DC now. I don't know if they're watching on a Friday. But they gave me, of course, the best presentation, and I threw it all out when I got here because I want to talk about something else. So they did a good job. I'm going to go a little off script, and so if I'm not as polished as everybody else here, I'm sorry, but I think there's a different conversation to be having, and it may be useful as a conversation starter for both today and for tomorrow when I know there's a smaller conversation. The right conversation is what is the right level of skin in the game for the various levels of government. I think too often we spend a lot of time playing around the margins. Well, I have control over this part of it, the local part, where I'm at the state level, so here's why we can only do this. And I don't think that's the right conversation to be having. What is the election system that we want to have in this country, that we deserve to have, that Americans expect us to have, and then how do you resource it? Because that is a different starting point than we're having. And I honestly do think that that means the federal government has to put skin in the game reliably. States do too, and the locals. To me, it is a little ridiculous that we ask locals to run elections, but who gets the top billing on these ballots? First is the federal races. The federal races usually gets the front page of the ballot on the federal contest, and yet they're not putting any money in. That's a little ridiculous. States get the next one, and then the local races follow after that. And yet, typically, and there's no way to generalize across every jurisdiction, the locals are putting in the most money, and that doesn't seem sustainable. And the other reason why that doesn't seem sustainable was made very clear by the last panel. When you have discretionary spending, and elections and everything at the local level is discretionary, you're never going to win against the potholes, against the schools, against the fire department. We need to find a better way to fund all of it. All right, so let's see. We clearly know that the funding mechanisms aren't working at the local level because it's really difficult, but we have the same incentive problem at the federal and state level. And so I'm going to put out there a kind of a crazy idea, and I'm happy to get shot down, but I think...
Is it 50% match?
It's not 50, that's crazy.
Sorry, Don.
I can't
Sorry,
endorse
Commissioner.
that. Look, and I don't even know if this is the solution, but what I want to start having, and what we've been trying to have at the Bipartisan Policy Center, is a different conversation that I think can lead to different solutions. And I'll start off by talking about a little bit what the federal government has gotten to before, why that might be the right level, and how to make that a reliable number. So we've seen about $1 billion or $1.25 billion, depending if you want to include the CARES Act money, since 2017 in funding. Traditionally, we haven't seen much money at all, but what Congress has been able to get to a couple times now is about $400 million. There's nothing special about that number. I mean, is it the right number? Who knows? Honestly, they got there by looking at how much had been authorized in the original HAVA that hadn't been appropriated. That's how they got to the initial $385 million. But Congress has gotten there. They got there for CARES Act too. And to me, that's the realm of the possible. That seems to be what Congress, that's the maximum we're going to get. I think we've wasted some opportunities in the past couple of years when you look at what could have been possible, especially in 2022. There was a moment for federal funding and somewhat reliable federal funding that was missed. And this was during the Build Back Better debate with Joe Biden. And I think a lot of the advocacy groups, and Tammy and I know it's great to have a lot more friends in the field, but you had a lot of friends in the field who didn't know what they were doing and kind of overshot the mark. And it became kind of a fact that elections needed to be fully funded by the federal government, and that required $20 billion over 10 years, which, as we've heard, they've gotten to $4 billion over the past 20 years. So that was a bit high, and it was unjustifiable, and it really set back the move towards getting reliable federal funding going forward, because it's really easy to ignore advocates like myself, like others, when we don't have a consistent message, or we don't have a consistent message that can be justified by the actual needs. $400 million has always been my number, or at least since the first time Congress did that back in 2017. And I do think that's a reliable number. So how do we get there? Look, the holy grail of funding in the federal government is getting your thing put into the mandatory budget. Discretionary budgets have to be passed by Congress. Congress can't pass anything right now. They have to pass a funding bill, but as you heard from Ben and as you heard from Don, we are a rounding error. There's very few advocates for it, and so how can we make federal funding, how can we make available reliable federal funding going forward? And here's the crazy idea that I want to posit to you, and again, happy to take questions on it, but happy to think of any other crazy ideas that are out there, and we should talk about those too. How many of you have done your taxes yet for the 2023 tax year? The election officials, of course. Sorry, that should have been obvious.
It isn't April yet.
It's not April yet, but look, I normally would have done it yet, but I haven't gotten there. How many of you reliably check that checkbox that says, thank you, Avery, I want to devote $3 or $6 if you're filing jointly towards the presidential election campaign fund? Anybody? In the last tax year, that was about 3% of the people who did that. 3% of the tax returns pressed that. So that fund, which was set up in 1974 after Watergate, was a public financing of presidential elections. It provided funding for primaries and for the general election, but if you accepted that money, there were spending caps. And that was all fine and good until the spending caps didn't keep pace with the cost of elections. And so the last presidential general election candidate who took any money from this campaign fund was John McCain. So we're talking 2008 was the last time this fund was used for public financing of elections. And it has covered other things too. For a while, the parties were granted money from this fund for their conventions. Federal law changed in, I think, 2018 to say we're not doing that anymore. But for the most part, even at 3% of the tax returns directing this federal funding towards this fund, the fund now has $400 million in it. At its peak in 1974, right after the Nixon scandals, 28% of people were checking that box. And the reason why was because, first of all, this is a very unique opportunity for Americans to actually direct a portion of their tax liability to a specific thing that they value. It doesn't raise your tax liability. You're just saying, of the money I owe the federal government, I want $3 or $6 going to this pot because it's important we have free and fair elections where people have the money to campaign and run and whatever. Look, campaign finance is an impossible issue at this point. BPC doesn't work on campaign finance at all, so I don't feel bad taking the money away from them. But I do think right now voters do care about election administration. In fact, voters on both sides care about election administration. They don't prioritize the same things, but it's actually bipartisan when you look at do people care about what's going on in elections. And again, that could mean that they want more security, could mean they want more access, but to me, that's an opportunity. Because if we got back to 28% of tax returns checking that box, the estimates that my team has done at BPC, we'd have about $200 million a year going into the fund. If you raise the checkoff to $5 for singles, $10 for joint, that's $400 million a year going into this fund that then could be reliably sent to the states by the EAC on an annual basis. It wouldn't require necessarily Congress doing a discretionary funding cycle. It would be reliable. And to me, that solves a lot of the other problems that we've heard today and yesterday. Secretary Schwab talked about, well, he can't release some of the original HAVA funds because he doesn't know when he's going to get any more. Well, if he knows he's getting them every year, somewhere in the $400 million for the entire country level, that changes that problem. And that should also eventually be getting more down to the localities. Look, there's a lot of different ways to structure this, but I think these are the kind of solutions we're going to need to start talking about if we want to get to somewhat reliable federal funding. The other piece of this, and I know, we heard from Charles earlier, and he wants to consolidate a bunch of elections offices, and Don wants to go 50-50 state and federal, and so we've angered a lot of constituencies today, and I'm not going to be the one up here who doesn't do that. So I do think, I hear Tammy's constituents when we go to Election Center, and they want the federal funding with no strings attached. I don't think that's viable right now. I think the federal government isn't going to give it no strings attached. I do think, again, there is a bipartisan set of issues, minimum standards really, that could be met, and if met, the states will be allowed to access this $400 million that's coming in annually, hopefully. BPC back in 2022, right around the time that H.R. 1, Freedom to Vote Act was crashing and burning, which was predictable because it was a very partisan bill, we put out a report with R Street, which is a DC-based think tank that is on the right, with Unite America, which is a funder that's a little bit on the left, with AEI, which is a little bit on the right. So we had a broad spectrum of input, and we came up with about 5 different areas that you could create bipartisan minimum standards around that are doable. Look, I'm not saying we're going to have 29 days of early voting. That's not viable. Most states can't do that. Most counties can't do that. But there is a suite of issues, and it's for a real conversation, what level of voter identification should be the minimum base standard? Should there be a minimum standard for early voting and how you do it. I think these are real questions, and I think both parties have demands that they actually make of the voting process that can be horse traded into a minimum standard for elections. And I'll say I do think that this is viable because even though it's nice to say local officials know their voters the best, and that is true, I do think more than ever, voters see what's happening in other states, they see what's happening in other counties, and if we're going to have an equitable election process across this country, there needs to be a baseline standard. I want to make sure we have time for you all to yell me down, but you go read the report. I can send it to Tammy. I'm sure we can share it around. I do think what was interesting in doing that report is only 2 states right now are meeting all of the standards that our collection of 5 organizations put out there. And the 2 states that we're doing it are Colorado, which is a very heavily all-male state, and Georgia. These are 2 very different states, and yet they were the ones that were meeting the minimum standard across all 5 different areas. But of the minimum standards, the vast majority of states were meeting at least 75% of them. So again, we're not talking we have to revolutionize how we do election administration in this country. I do think reliable federal funding that kind of leads to raising all boats with minimum standards that are achievable is where we need to be. So that's where I'll stop with my intro.
That's a good intro.
Thank you.
So there are a few things that I wanted to tease out of your comments and some of the work that you all have done at BPC. And one of the things that I think is challenging is that we have the situation where we want to maintain autonomy, and autonomy is great until it isn't. And what does it take? A close election. So once you get a close election, and no matter what the close election is, if it's a close election in just your county and it is a mayoral race that's close, or it's across and you realize that some of your polling places did things a little differently, or it's a statewide race and you realize that some of the counties did things a little differently, or it's a presidential race and of course the states are doing things a little differently, that's when these questions really surface. And I think that it really started in 2000 with Florida, and we saw it recently in the distinctions being made in Pennsylvania, because they had some close races there, and in Arizona and in other places. So it takes one election that's really close, and any jurisdiction in the country is going to be and could be called to task and everything questioned. And so having that uniformity can also be a good defense. But the question then is, how do you do that if you have varying levels of funding? And also knowing that, when Janet was mentioning she would love it if there were, if there was someone who could take the tool and have the thing and come and show you how to set it up and then leave. U.S. Digital Response does that in many places, but that is a nonprofit, and now places are precluded from receiving those services. And other solutions are out there, whether it's an online tool to say how many drop boxes should I have and where's the general proximity that they should go, or a wait time tool to say if I have 4 people instead of 6 at the check-in, what's my wait time? Those are all tools that are being provided freely online, but if they're being funded by philanthropy, that can be a problem. So how do we, in this void, in this environment, make sure that the needs are still being met?
I mean, again, I think that's right. I do agree that at this point, with the national attention on elections that we have, intrastate variation of how you're interpreting state law is a huge problem. And you're one ballot away from litigation, right? And we saw this everywhere in 2020. I think the most obvious one, and here's why. One, voters don't like that. They don't like that the county next door gets more access, than somebody else. This was mostly very evident in Wisconsin, right? So Dane County was very permissive with how they did drop boxes, and that
You
was
could take them to
seen-
the park on Saturday, and
Right.
the election official was there. You could walk your dog, drop off your
Which is
ballot.
great, and maybe that's a good thing to do. I don't know. I mean, did it work for them? It worked for them, but does it work for the whole state? I don't know. And it fuels the conspiracies. Well, why were we only doing this in a large jurisdiction? That large jurisdiction happened to be one that had a lot of Democrats, right? And so I think you do need to be relatively the same across interstate policy administration. But I also do think that, again, the argument that I hear constantly, and I've been around elections for a long time, and I understand it, but I do think it's changing, and we have to either acknowledge it or think about it a little bit more. Voters are pretty understanding about what's happening in other states now, and they are seeing the big variations. The news doesn't stop at the state line, and so when you're seeing huge variations in what states are doing, that is an issue, and I do think that would be solved by getting up to the what I'm calling federal minimum standards, but I would only advocate for that with the dedicated, reliable funding source, which I think, again, is possible, but not through a discretionary budget process like the one we are doing now.
Well, I think one of the things that I've been, and you mentioned the stories crossing state lines and jurisdiction lines, and some places have, the media market serves multiple states. One of the things that I've been trying when I talk to reporters and editors is to say, when you're covering election administration, don't immediately look at something and think, is this part of a conspiracy theory that I can get clicks for? Think about it in what's driving this particular challenge or issue. And is it a lack of funding or resources? And so there's that tension, and we heard it in the panels, of serving the public need, but also being a good steward of the public funds. So you have to do, it's a little bit of a science and an art. You have to be able to read the tea leaves to know how many ballots should I print up. If I print up too many, I'm going to be held to task because I wasted all that money. Now, in Arizona, we were required to print 110% of the registered voters. It wasn't based on turnout, it was 110%, but we had 70% of our voters voting by mail. So we knew 70% were going to be used. So then it was just printing up that remaining balance of who was going to be out there, right? But in a primary election, we were sending literally a semi-load to shred because they were never voted on. Is that good use of public funds? Not so much. But how many of us have seen the headlines when people didn't print up enough? It's there on election line almost every election cycle. And that's the problem, is you have these tensions of, if you know that you have funds, but they're limited, and you always want to be conscious of how you're spending those funds, having the ability to both kind of read those tea leaves is really a challenge.
Well, and the other tension that you're not saying, but you mentioned earlier, is the incentives to spend as little as possible, right? I mean, before, you saw most election officials staying in those roles for 30, 40 years. And that was kind of like, that was the role they wanted. That's not necessarily true anymore, certainly not at the state level. But even more locally, you're seeing more of those people who are running elections have incentives because they're running for higher office at some point. And that is why, again, I think having the federal discretionary budget as part of this doesn't work anymore, because we know what Congress wants to do. They want to spend as little as possible. This is not a priority. No one votes on elections. Sorry. You vote through elections. You don't vote because of what Congress is doing on elections, is what I meant to say. And so it's an easy thing to ignore or to spend as little on as possible. And so I do think we need to find a way to make the funding outside of the process.
Great. I don't want to belabor the point.
I will.
So, and I also want to turn over and provide enough time for questions. So, Commissioner Palmer?
Yes. Talk a little bit about the fund. Who owns it? Who appropriates money into it? Is it self-generating? Are they willing to give up that stream? Because a lot of it's being used. What do you know that you can tell us about it?
Sure. I mean, the fund belongs to all of us, right? It's sitting in the Treasury Department. You can see their monthly reports. They update the balance monthly, and no one's taking any money out of it because based on current federal law, the only things it can be used for is funding of primaries at the presidential level, if you agree to certain spending limits, or generals at the presidential level. And so it's sitting there. Now, what I'm proposing does require a change to federal law. You'd have to change what the purpose of the fund is. But the fact that we are directing money into that fund that right now ostensibly can't be spent seems like a poor use of federal funding. There is a need. The need matches what I think can get into the fund on a reasonable basis every year. That to me is kind of an elegant solution. But it's out there. I mean, it's just sitting in the federal government, just kind of there for the taking. Now, look, I'm not the only one who wants to take that money. Others have also recommended ending that checkoff box and just reappropriating the $400 million for other things, pay down the national debt, do X, Y, and Z. But I do think the easiest solution is we've had a checkoff box now that relates to elections in this country for 50 years. It's the only checkoff box on your federal tax return that you can make. And there's a lot of interest in how elections are run, or if you go to the public, how well they're not run. So let's give the people who run them more money and see if we can do better. That's why I think this is the right solution, but I acknowledge there are definitely other ones out there.
And maybe I'm always a firm believer in moving the very large ship slowly, right? So if the intention is for primaries, but for candidates, as opposed to, we heard from Mr. Caskey about the fact that there will be a primary election here, a presidential preference election, that maybe it's the case that the funds could be used to pay for presidential preference elections all around the country. And I say that because Arizona had PPEs as well. So the taxpayers of Arizona have been paying for that for decades. So it seems like a really good idea for them. Maybe there are ways to increase the funding of the elections from the federal government in a way that is still kind of aligns with the core mission of what that was, but then we know what would happen.
Well,
the states
fund
would
was
change
for-
to having
yeah.
PPEs, and that would be one more election for everyone to have to conduct.
Well, just to clarify, the fund is available for primaries or generals, but it's just for presidentials.
Right.
Only presidential candidates can access it. And I did look this morning. So when John McCain accessed that funding in 2008, he was granted from the fund $84 million. That was what you got, and that's what you could spend. That money is tagged to certain inflation metrics. A presidential candidate who took it now would get $123.1 million. So you can see why they're never going to take this again. I mean, we're spending multiples of that at this point, and they can raise multiples of that. And so this fund is not going to be viable it's not viable anymore as a presidential election campaign fund. And so, again, it could sit there for the next 30 years, and it can accrue the $23 million it's getting every year, or we can find a better way to increase the percentage of people who are checking that box and actually spend it on something that people are saying is important to them, but the Congress itself has no incentive to fund.
Any other questions, comments, closing remarks?
In the effort to encourage you to upset as many people as possible, I have the
Happy to
following
do
question. So you came out with your ideas around the amount at the federal level that would be useful, achievable, reliable, and even some of the strings attached for minimum standards. Have you done the same exercise at the next level down at the state in terms of per capita or per registered voter and requirements?
We haven't. And that's where Don's point about the state buy-in, I think, is important. It's fun to throw Don under the bus, but I think that the states would probably have to put in something more than the 5% that they're being asked to put in. There needs to be an equitable distribution of the costs. I mean, it is insanity that we are asking the local governments to fund this. They don't have the budgetary process doesn't understand the issues that are being put in front of them, and the states and federal government should value elections as a core function of government. I mean, I know, Tammy, you said a couple times today about the prohibition of private funding, and I do support the prohibition of private funding. I don't like the idea of private funding going towards a exclusively government function. It should be a government function, but you can't prohibit extra funding and then not fund the elections
We shouldn't
by
have
the
to have a
government.
bake sale.
It is ridiculous.
Right?
Like,
We shouldn't have to.
right, and that's why you got to flip the conversation that we've been having a little bit on its head and start with what is the process that we want, and then what does that cost, and then how do you divide up the pie? That is how you do it.
I think it's a fascinating idea. And also, I don't know how many other states, most states also have a checkoff. We have, was it the chickadee checkoff?
The chicken checkoff?
Chickadee checkoff, that
Huh.
goes for, was it non-game species or something like that? There's an arts one, and now I think, is there a nutrition one for seniors? But I think other states have, like you could almost take it to a state level also.
That's interesting.
I don't know how much money comes, I'm right, I mean, we come up with a cool name like, Chickadee Checkoff will be.
Yeah.
So
Got
I
a
think
little alliteration going on.
So I think it actually has applications even past the federal level, but I think it's a fascinating idea.
I mean, look, I didn't know about the chickadee checkoff, but
I just want to say chickadee checkoff.
I'm going to say it as many
and
times
I
as
may
can
say
tonight.
chickadee checkoff quite a bit in the next 24 hours.
So,
just
is
'cause
it
it's
similar
fun.
that it doesn't raise your tax liability? It just you're getting to direct a little bit of your Kansas. It is just unusual. I mean, how often do we hear from taxpayers that, well, why are we funding this thing? I don't support this, but we don't really give them a whole lot of opportunities to do this very directly, and we wouldn't want it to proliferate outside of our very important issue of elections, and that's really hard to keep it narrow. But again, it's the only federal checkoff, and it's not a new thing. This is the 50th anniversary of it, so it's been around for a very long time. People are used to it, but I like the idea. If we could do it for federal, and you go down to the states, and that would certainly help the states understand where the people are on this issue.
Yes.
Just a little clarification. It's hardly worth the microphone, but has it always been $3?
No. No, it started off
I feel
as
like
$1 and $2, single and
So
joint.
so if it's 50 years old, it started out as $1 and then it went up to $2 and now it's at $3?
No, so it started as a $1 for single filers and $2 for joint.
Got
About
it.
15 years ago, they changed it to 3 and 6, or 15 or 20 years ago. I have to look back. I have to look at that, but it wasn't that long ago. But inflation-adjusted numbers, again, when it was hitting 28%, that's about the $200 to $400 million range. It depends if it's the 3 or the 6, but I mean that we can certainly get up to a reasonable number. And I think when we talk about federal funding, there's the amount and then there's the one-time distributions that we get. I think they wouldn't say it too loudly. Election officials would care less if the number was lower, as long as it was reliable, right? And so they would accept a lower amount annually if they knew that was always going to be about the amount. That is, I think, where we can get with a kind of fund like this. Whatever goes into the fund, that's what gets distributed. But so it wouldn't be exactly the same every year. It could vary, but I don't think it would vary that much.
And we have some other areas where there is federally funded parts of election administration. Military and overseas voters, you don't pay for ballot postage or election materials being mailed out for UOCAVA voters. That's all taken care of through a special indicia. Free matter for the blind. So if you're mailing out large print or braille ballots, which is something I did in Maricopa, there's no postage being paid for that. So there's a franking budget that Congress has. It's pretty big.
Don't touch their freaking budget.
I know, but I'm just saying it's okay for.
Now you're going to piss off all of
I know. See,
Congress.
this is my job. I get to bring us all home by me getting people upset.
Wow.
No, so I think that there are ways that we can talk about the ability for individual skin in the game, which you said that, and you can't read my handwriting. My very first thing I said, or I put here that I wanted to talk to you about was skin in the game, and you just came up with that part beautifully. So I do think that we need to talk about that a little bit more. I'm conscious of the time that we have here, so we've got a couple more. Yes.
I was just going to suggest that I think that's a great idea in terms of applying it to federal elections, but I think there needs to be a nexus, and the nexus is cybersecurity, and because that's in the international realm, and that's in the national interest. But I think it's really tough to get members of Congress to say, elections aren't local. Because even at the federal level, we don't really have federal elections. We don't all elect the president. We locally vote for an elector, to go represent us. And all elections are local. We vote for a representative to represent us in Congress. We vote for a representative to represent us in the legislature. This is all of our community voting. And so all elections are local, with the exception of the state elections, where we are collectively voting for a governor, or we're collectively voting for a senator to represent us in the United States Senate. So it's very tough to argue at the federal level that the federal government should be funding these elections, which the founders meant to be local. You know, we take great pride in our state elections. So I think the nexus has to be around security, and it has to be around protecting the integrity of the elections from international actors.
I think that's a good point. And look, I am not the marketing expert. You can ask anyone on my team. So I think there's a marketing campaign you'd want to put around this. I agree that it's a tougher sell, but I'd push back a little bit and say there are no problems in Kansas. I know where I am right now. But when we do see problems that happen in individual races, that becomes the national narrative about why you can't trust elections. And so, yes, I completely understand the structure that we have here and that, we want to make it local. But, Antrim County, Michigan, no one knew where that was before 2020, and it became the story of the election. So we do need to resource the smallest counties for sure, and get them up to a level that is commensurate with the fact that we're the most powerful country in the world, and we're trying to run elections, our democracy, on the cheap, which is not doable.
Which, of course, brings us to the
Well, I'm not saying
accurate,
that.
fast, or cheap, and you
Yeah.
get to pick two of the three.
Yeah.
So what two is it going to be? You want it to be accurate and fast, then it ain't going to be cheap. You want it to be fast and cheap, not going to be accurate. And you can do all the other machinations. So that's kind of where we set. Did we have closing thoughts? Time. So let's first thank Matt
Absolutely.
and the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you, sir.